Some wounds can't be seen. David Cole wheels through Westbrook unnoticed, a black veteran whose paralysis makes him invisible to a town built on corruption. They see only what his wheelchair represents: limitation, brokenness, a man no longer whole. They never bothered to look into his eyes. When corrupt detectives frame him for a crime he didn't commit, they unleash something that was never truly contained: a precision weapon disguised as a broken man. A Delta Force phantom who traded war zones for quiet streets. As he dismantles their empire piece by calculated piece, Senator Langston and his network of dirty cops learn a lesson written in fear. The most dangerous predator is the one you never recognized was hunting you. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sunlight glinted off the chrome of David Cole's wheelchair as he maneuvered down the cracked sidewalk of Pine Street. His powerful shoulders worked steadily, propelling him forward with practiced ease. At 48, David's body remained impressively muscular despite the paralysis that claimed everything below his waist. His close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him a distinguished appearance that commanded respect without demanding it. Most people in Westbrook saw David as just another disabled veteran, someone to be pitied, helped across streets, or simply ignored. Few bothered to notice the calculating intelligence behind his dark brown eyes or the way he constantly scanned his surroundings. They didn't see how he mentally mapped every exit, noted every potential threat, or positioned himself to always have clear sightlines. These weren't the habits of an ordinary man, but the ingrained instincts of someone trained to survive in the deadliest environments on Earth. As David approached the corner of Pine and Wilson, he paused to check his watch. 7:30. Right, on schedule. The morning routine never varied. Breakfast at Della's diner, followed by opening his security consulting firm by 9. The predictability wasn't laziness, it was strategic. Routines made him invisible. Invisible meant safe. Safe meant control. "Morning, Mr. Cole," called Jimmy, the homeless veteran who always occupied the bench outside the pharmacy. David nodded, reaching into his pocket. "Morning, Jimmy. How's the knee today?" "Barking like a junkyard dog," Jimmy said, accepting the $20 bill David discreetly passed him. "Weather's changing." "Got those names I asked about?" Jimmy leaned closer. 3 new dealers working the high school. Young guys, well-armed, moving product for someone big. Word is they answer to Detective Miller. David's expression remained neutral, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Thanks, Jimmy. Stay warm." Inside Della's diner, the morning rush was in full swing. The air hung heavy with the smell of bacon and coffee. David maneuvered his chair to his usual corner table, back to the wall, full view of both entrances and the kitchen. Della, a woman in her 60s with dyed red hair and a perpetual, cigarette-roughened voice, smiled as she approached. "The usual handsome?" she asked, coffee pot already tilting toward his mug. "Please, Della," David replied, allowing himself a small smile. "Busy morning?" "Same old crowd," she said, filling his cup. "Though those two have been here for an hour. Already." She subtly nodded toward a booth near the door. David had already registered the men when he entered. 2 plainclothes detectives, Robert Miller and James Slade. Miller, the senior of the pair, was tall and rangy with prematurely gray hair and cold blue eyes. Slade was shorter, stockier, with a perpetual smirk that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. Both wore shoulder holsters poorly concealed beneath department store jackets. "Eggs'll be up in 5, Della said, before moving on to her next table. David sipped his coffee, monitoring the detectives in his peripheral vision. They weren't there for breakfast. They were watching the door, waiting for someone. Their posture was too tense, their eyes too focused. The bell above the door jingled as a black teenager entered. He couldn't have been more than 16, skinny, wearing jeans and a hoodie from the local high school. The boy's eyes darted nervously around the diner until they landed on a young waitress. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Hey, Marcus," the waitress called. "Mom's in the back. Give her 5 minutes." The boy, Marcus, nodded and took a seat at the counter, his back to the detectives. David watched as Miller and Slade exchanged glances before sliding out of their booth. Something was about to happen. David set down his coffee and subtly adjusted his position. Miller approached first, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus Washington?" The boy tensed. "Yeah? Need to have a word with you outside," Slade added, moving to the boy's other side. "What for?" Marcus asked, his voice rising slightly. Several customers looked up. "Don't make a scene, kid," Miller said, tightening his grip. "We got reports you were lifting merchandise from Franklin's Hardware this morning." Marcus's eyes widened. "What? No way. I just came from home. My mom works here. Ask her." Yeah. "Tell it outside," Slade said, grabbing Marcus's arm. David watched as they started to forcefully escort the teenager toward the exit. The boy's mother hadn't emerged yet. Della was in the kitchen. No one was intervening. David noticed the security camera in the corner, its red light blinking as it captured everything. He made his decision. "Excuse me, detectives," David called, his voice calm but carrying authority that seemed to fill the suddenly quiet diner. Both men turned, irritation flashing across their faces. "This isn't your concern, sir," Miller said, emphasis on the last word dripping with condescension. David wheeled forward slightly. "I believe it might be. Your suspect claims he just arrived from home, not the hardware store." Slade sneered. "And you know that how exactly?" "Because I've been sitting here for 15 minutes, and the timestamp on that security camera will show he walked in approximately 90 seconds ago." David pointed to the camera. "Franklin's Hardware is 6 blocks from here. Unless he's secretly—" "The Flash! The timeline doesn't work." A murmur rippled through the diner. Marcus stood frozen between the detectives, hope dawning on his face. "Look, buddy," Miller said, stepping toward David. "I don't know who you think you are. I'm a concerned citizen pointing out that you're about to make a mistake." David replied evenly. "One that's being recorded by that camera and witnessed by everyone in this establishment." Something in David's unwavering gaze made Miller hesitate. The detective stared into David's eyes and seemed to recoil slightly, as though sensing something dangerous lurking beneath the calm exterior. The kitchen doors swung open as a woman in a waitress uniform rushed out. "Marcus, what's going on?" "Mrs. Washington," Slade said, switching to a more professional tone. "We have reason to believe your son was involved in a theft at Franklin's Hardware." "That's impossible," she said firmly. "He was helping his grandmother. Until 30 minutes ago, he came straight here after." David spoke up again. "Perhaps checking the hardware store's security footage would clear this up before making an arrest." Miller's face darkened with anger, but he released his grip on Marcus. "We'll look into it," he said tightly. "But we know what we know." As Marcus moved to his mother's side, Miller stepped closer to David's wheelchair, leaning down slightly. "You should mind your own business. Not everyone appreciates a hero." David smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "And not everyone appreciates abuse of power, detective. We all have our burdens to bear." Something in David's tone made Miller straighten up, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He gestured to Slade, and the two detectives left the diner, the bell jingling angrily behind them. As conversation slowly resumed, Marcus's mother approached David's table. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Those men have been hassling kids from our neighborhood for months." David nodded. "They're looking for easy targets, Mrs. Washington. Make sure Marcus knows his rights and carries his phone to record any interactions." After they left, David finished his breakfast in silence, though he noticed several patrons glancing his way with newfound respect. He paid his bill, leaving Della a generous tip as always, and wheeled himself out into the morning sunshine. Outside, he spotted Miller and Slade sitting in an unmarked police cruiser across the street. As David passed, Miller rolled down his window. "You've made a mistake, Cole," he called. "We know who you are now." David paused, turning his chair to face them fully. "That's interesting, detective, because I'm not sure you do." With that, he continued down the sidewalk, feeling their eyes boring into his back. 2 blocks away, his security consulting firm occupied a modest storefront between a barbershop and a family-owned grocery. The sign read simply, "Cole Security Solutions, Protection, Training, peace of mind. Inside, the reception area was immaculate. Minimalist furniture, framed certificates on the walls, and a desk where his assistant Alicia Taylor was already working. "Morning, boss," Alicia said, looking up from her computer. The 30-something woman had been with him for 3 years, handling the administrative side of the business with remarkable efficiency. "The Jefferson Academy kids will be here at 4 for their class." David nodded, wheeling toward his office. "Thanks, Alicia. Any calls?" "Just Mrs. Patterson. Wanted to thank you again for catching that stalker before the police would take her seriously." David grunted in acknowledgement. Most of his business involved standard security assessments for local businesses and homes, but occasionally he took on cases the police couldn't or wouldn't handle. It kept his skills sharp. His private office was different from the reception, more functional, less for show. Maps of the city covered one wall. Security monitors displayed feeds from cameras strategically placed around the building. A locked cabinet contained equipment most security consultants wouldn't possess. David wheeled himself to his desk and opened his laptop. He typed a name, Detective Robert Miller. Time to know his enemy. Meanwhile, across town in a nondescript, government building, a woman in a pressed military uniform sat at a computer terminal. Colonel Patricia Harris scrolled through a classified file, her expression growing increasingly concerned. On her screen, a redacted military record displayed a younger David Cole in full combat gear, standing with other elite soldiers. The file was labeled, David Cole, Top Secret, Delta Force Operative, Team Ghost. She picked up her secure phone. "Sir, we may have a situation in Westbrook. One of our retired operatives has appeared on the local police radar." She paused, listening. "Yes, sir. David Cole. The Phantom." Another pause. "No, sir. If they're antagonizing him, they have no idea what they're dealing with." As evening fell across Westbrook, David wheeled himself through his apartment, checking security systems and preparing for the night. His home was a fortress disguised as an ordinary first-floor apartment. Reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, hidden panic rooms, and escape routes. Not paranoia. Preparation. In his bedroom, David transferred from his wheelchair to his bed with practiced ease, his powerful upper body compensating for his useless legs. He reached beneath his pillow, confirming his Sig Sauer was still in place. Something felt wrong tonight. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through 3 war zones and countless Black Ops missions, were screaming danger. Outside, parked in an unmarked car half a block away, Detectives Miller and Slade watched David's apartment. "Who is this guy anyway?" Slade asked, sipping cold coffee. "Some disability rights activist?" Miller shook his head. "Ex-military, according to his business license. Special forces, probably. But that doesn't matter. He embarrassed us in public. Nobody does that." "So what's the play?" Slade asked. Miller smiled coldly. "We give him a taste of his own medicine. Make him a suspect in the Jackson arms dealing case. The one we've been building against Stewart? Stewart's untouchable with his connections. We need a conviction, and Cole's perfect. No family, few friends, and nobody's going to believe a cripple could fight back against the evidence we'll plant." Slade considered this. "Sheriff Calloway will need convincing." "Leave Calloway to me," Miller said, starting the car. "Buy this. Time tomorrow David Cole will wish he'd never heard our names." As they drove away, neither noticed the small mirror positioned in David's window, reflecting their car to where he lay in darkness, watching and waiting. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Westbrook Sheriff's Department illuminated Detective Miller's face as he hunched over his computer, meticulously constructing David Cole's fictional criminal past. The precinct was mostly empty at 1 a.m., with only a skeleton crew of night shift officers manning the front desk and patrol cars. "How's it coming?" Detective Slade asked, setting 2 coffee cups on the desk. Miller didn't look up. "Almost done. Getting the criminal record needed to be perfect. Timestamps, case numbers, arresting officers. Cole now has a history of weapons trafficking stretching back 5 years. Slade leaned over Miller's shoulder, watching his fabricated arrest reports populated on the screen. "You think anyone will check these too closely?" Calloway signed off on it. "Nobody's going to question the sheriff." Miller clicked through several screens. Besides, by the time anyone might start digging, Cole will be in a cell at County and will have found enough evidence at his place to keep him there. Slade grinned, sipping his coffee. What did you tell Calloway to get him on board? That Cole's security firm is cutting into the protection racket we run for Stewart. That's all he needed to hear. Miller saved the files with a decisive click. Plus, I mentioned how Cole humiliated us at the diner. Calloway doesn't like when his department looks weak. SWAT teams ready for the raid? Slade asked. Miller nodded. Johnson's team. They're hungry for action. Been weeks since they had a decent raid. Told them Cole might be armed and dangerous. A guy in a wheelchair? Slade laughed. That'll be something to see. Miller's expression remained serious. Don't underestimate him. There's something off about Cole. The way he carries himself, the way he watched us, it's like he's been waiting for trouble. What, you think he's some kind of super soldier? Slade mocked. I think he's more than he appears, Miller replied. Which is why we're sending in SWAT at 2 a.m. with full tactical gear. I want him shocked, overwhelmed, and humiliated. Across town, David Cole was wide awake, sensing the approaching storm. He hadn't slept. Instead, he'd methodically prepared. His apartment, making subtle adjustments only someone with his training would notice. Nothing illegal. He wasn't going to give them ammunition, but strategic preparations nonetheless. His phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. They're coming. Tonight. Gee. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ghost, his former reconnaissance specialist from Delta Force, had been watching his back for years. The warning confirmed what his instincts had already told him. He wheeled himself to the window, carefully staying in shadows as he observed the street below. A nondescript van had parked at the corner 2 hours ago. Ordinary residents wouldn't notice the slight fogging of the windows indicating body heat within, or the occasional glint of metal as someone shifted position. David moved to his bedroom, opened a hidden compartment in his closet, and removed a small device. He plugged it into his laptop, typing rapidly. The device would send all his security footage to an encrypted cloud server that only Ghost could access. Evidence. He transferred back to his bed, removed his watch, and placed it on the nightstand. To anyone watching, he appeared to be settling, in for sleep. In reality, he was preparing for war. At the precinct, Sheriff Thomas Calloway reviewed the operation one final time. At 55, Calloway maintained the physique of the college linebacker he'd once been, though years of bribes and protection money had added a thickness around his middle. You're sure about this, Miller? He asked, eyeing the fabricated file. Cole's got a clean record as far as I can see, runs a legitimate business. That's his cover, Miller insisted. We've been tracking his activities for months. He's using his security firm to move weapons for the cartels. The evidence is solid. Calloway looked dubious. Solid enough for a middle-of-the-night SWAT raid? We have a confidential informant who says Cole is moving a major shipment tomorrow. If we don't hit tonight, we lose our chance. And this has nothing to do with him embarrassing you at Della's? Calloway fixed Miller with a hard stare. Miller met his gaze unflinchingly. This is about enforcing the law, sir. Cole's no innocent. After a moment, Calloway nodded. Fine, but I want this by the book. Body cams on, everything documented. If this goes south, it's on you. Understood, sir, Miller replied, suppressing a smile. At 1:50 a.m., the SWAT van pulled onto David Street, followed by 3 patrol cars with lights off. Lieutenant Johnson, the SWAT commander, gathered his team for final instructions. Target is David Cole, suspected arms dealer, confined to a wheelchair but considered potentially dangerous. We go in hard and fast, secure the suspect, then search for weapons. Johnson looked at his team. Standard breach, room clearing, and containment. Questions? A younger officer spoke up. Sir, if he's in a wheelchair, is full tactical really necessary? We don't take chances, Johnson replied firmly. Miller says he has military training. Stick to protocol. As the team approached David's apartment building, Miller and Slade arrived, hanging back to watch. Miller keyed his radio. All units in position. Execute on my mark. Inside, David heard the soft footfalls on the exterior walkway. 6 men, heavily equipped, moving with tactical discipline. Time slowed as his combat training kicked in. He made no move to resist or escape. That wasn't the play. Instead, he activated the recording devices hidden throughout his apartment with a subtle click of a remote beside his bed. Then he waited, breathing steady, mind clear. Execute! Miller's voice crackled over the radio. The front door burst open, with a thunderous crash as the battering ram splintered the frame. Flashbang grenades detonated in the entryway, designed to disorient and incapacitate. SWAT officers poured in, weapons raised, shouting commands. Police! Freeze! Hands where we can see them. David remained perfectly still in his bed, hands visible on top of the blanket. The bedroom door flew open, tactical lights blinding as officers surrounded him. On the ground. Now. I can't, David stated calmly. I'm paraplegic. The lead officer hesitated momentarily before barking, Secure the suspect. 2 officers grabbed David roughly, dragging him from his bed and throwing him to the floor. His legs twisted uselessly beneath him as they forced his arms behind his back, cinching zip ties tightly around his wrists. Suspect secured, the officer reported into his radio. David offered no resistance, his face pressed against the cold hardwood floor. His eyes, however, remained alert, recording every face, every badge number, every procedural violation. The officers searched his bedroom, pulling drawers open, upending furniture. Miller and Slade entered, looking satisfied at the scene before them. David Cole, Miller announced loudly, you're under arrest for illegal weapons trafficking and conspiracy to distribute firearms to known felons. David said nothing, watching as Slade moved to his closet and reached into his jacket pocket. David knew exactly what would happen next. Slade emerged moments later, holding a handgun. Look what we have. Here, Slade announced triumphantly. Unregistered weapon, serial number filed off. That's not mine, David stated calmly. Sure it isn't, Miller laughed, kneeling beside David. Funny how criminals always say that. The SWAT team continued searching the apartment, finding nothing else of interest. David was unceremoniously dragged to his wheelchair and secured to it with additional restraints. As they wheeled him out, neighbors began emerging from surrounding apartments drawn by the commotion. What's happening? Asked Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman from across the hall. Police business, ma'am, an officer responded. Please return to your apartment. That's David Cole, another neighbor exclaimed. He helps people. He's no criminal. Miller stepped forward. Sir, we have evidence Mr. Cole is involved in serious criminal activity. Please step back. Word spread quickly as David was wheeled toward the waiting patrol cars. Residents gathered, many filming with their phones. It was exactly what Miller and Slade hadn't wanted. Witnesses. Outside, the cool night air carried the sounds of police, radios, and murmuring onlookers. David remained silent as officers transferred him to a patrol car, roughly maneuvering him into the back seat. Miller dismissed the SWAT team and slid into the driver's seat, Slade joining him up front. As they pulled away, David finally spoke. You planted that gun. Miller chuckled, meeting David's eyes in the rearview mirror. Prove it. Every inch of my apartment is under surveillance, David replied evenly, including my closet. Miller's smile faltered slightly. Bullshit. We searched for cameras. Not all surveillance looks like cameras, detective. Slade turned in his seat. Shut up back there. Nobody's going to believe a cripple over 2 decorated detectives. David tilted his head slightly, studying. Slade with the calculating precision of a predator. You should have done your research, he said softly. What's that supposed to mean? Miller demanded. David smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that momentarily unsettled both detectives. It means you've made a tactical error. When hunting, one should always know their prey. You threatening us? Slade asked incredulously. Not at all, David replied, simply offering professional advice. The ride to the station continued in tense silence. David used the time to mentally map their route, noting that they weren't taking the most direct path to the precinct. Instead, they turned onto River Road, a secluded stretch alongside the Westbrook River, rarely traveled at this hour. Miller pulled the car over in a darkened stretch near the water's edge and killed the engine. "Get him out," he ordered Slade. Slade opened the rear door and roughly yanked David from the seat, dumping him onto the gravelly roadside. Without his wheelchair, David could only prop himself up on his elbows, legs useless beneath him. Miller loomed over him. "Let me explain how this works, Cole. You're going to jail for a long time unless you cooperate." "Cooperate how?" David asked, seemingly unfazed by his vulnerable position. "Sign a confession admitting to the weapons charges. In exchange, we recommend minimum security and a reduced sentence." David laughed, a genuine, amused sound that clearly angered both detectives. "Something funny?" Slade demanded, his hand drifting toward his service weapon. "Very," David replied. "You think this is about getting a conviction. It's not. It's about making me disappear." Miller's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." Senator Langston's protection racket, the drug pipeline through the high school, the confiscated evidence that mysteriously vanishes from lockup. David watched their expressions shift from anger to shock. "Oh yes, I know all about your operation. I've been mapping it for months." Miller's face darkened with rage. "You're in no position to make accusations." "I'm not making accusations," David replied calmly. "I'm stating facts. Facts that are currently being uploaded to several secure servers, along with tonight's footage." Slade moved suddenly, his boot connecting with David's ribs. David absorbed the blow without a sound, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," Miller snarled. "That's where you're wrong, detective," David said, his voice taking on a steely quality neither man had heard before. "You're the ones who don't understand what you've started." Something, in his tone a deadly certainty, made both detectives pause. Slade looked to Miller for direction. "Get him back in the car," Miller ordered after a moment. "We'll let Calloway deal with him." As they roughly hauled David back into the patrol car, a distant figure watched through high-powered night vision, binoculars. The observer touched an earpiece and spoke softly. "Packages on the move again. Proceeding to the station. Operation Fallen Phantom is active." Miles away, in a secure government facility, Colonel Patricia Harris reviewed the incoming surveillance footage from David's apartment. Her expression hardened as she watched the SWAT team's entry and the detectives planting evidence. "Contact the director," she ordered her aide. "Tell him we have a code black. One of our operators has been compromised by corrupt local law enforcement." "Yes, Colonel," the aide replied. "Should we initiate extraction?" Harris considered this for a moment. "No, not yet. Cole can handle himself. Let's see how this plays out." Back at the Westbrook Sheriff's Department, David was processed and booked, his fingerprints and mugshot taken by officers who treated him with undisguised contempt. His requests for his wheelchair and legal representation were ignored. Instead, he was dragged to an isolation cell in the basement, a damp, cold, concrete room with a metal cot and no window. As the door slammed shut, David heard Miller's parting words. "You should have stayed out of our way," David smiled in the darkness. "You should have done your research," he repeated softly. Alone in the cell, David began systematically testing his surroundings, his mind already working on 3 different escape scenarios. The detectives thought they had caged a crippled man. In reality, they had locked themselves in with a predator they couldn't begin to understand. Outside in the parking lot, a nondescript van with heavily tinted windows maintained surveillance on the precinct. Inside, a figure known only as Ghost monitored communications while uploading the incriminating footage from David's apartment to a secure server. "Hang tight, Phantom," Ghost murmured. "Cavalry's gathering." The opening moves had been made. The game was now in play, and David Cole, the Phantom of Delta Force, was exactly where he needed to be to burn it all down. The isolation cell in the basement of Westbrook County Jail reeked of bleach and despair. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, marking time with monotonous precision. David Cole lay on the cold metal cot, eyes closed but fully alert, counting the footsteps of guards passing in the corridor outside. 3 days had passed since his arrest. 3 days without his wheelchair, proper medical attention, or contact with the outside world. For most paraplegics, these conditions would have been torturous, potentially deadly. For David, they were merely inconvenient. His Delta Force training had prepared him for far worse. The cell door scraped open, flooding the small space with harsh fluorescent light. Warden Brooks filled the doorway, his massive frame nearly blocking out the light behind him. At 6'4", with shoulders like an offensive lineman, Brooks cut an intimidating figure, his shaved head gleaming under the lights, a perpetual sneer etched onto his face. "Rise and shine, Cole," Brooks said, voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "Although I guess rising isn't really in your wheelhouse, is it?" 2 guards snickered behind him. David remained silent, eyes now open, taking in every detail. Brooks wore an expensive watch that didn't match his warden's salary. The guard on the left had bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, withdrawal symptoms. The one on the right kept his hand near his baton, eager for an excuse. "Nothing to say?" Brooks stepped closer. "They told me you were mouthy with the detectives." David finally spoke, his voice surprisingly strong despite his circumstances. "I requested medical attention and my wheelchair on arrival. Both are required by law." Brooks laughed. "Law? You're a criminal, Cole. Criminals don't get special treatment. In my facility." He kicked the edge of the cot. "Besides, what do you need a wheelchair for in a 6x8 cell?" "Documentation," David replied calmly. "Every ADA violation is being recorded and will be part of my lawsuit when this is over." The warden's face darkened. "You threatening me, boy?" David held his gaze steadily. "Not a threat. A fact." Brooks stepped forward, grabbing David by the collar and hauling him upright. "Listen carefully. I've broken men twice your size in this place. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging for mercy." David didn't resist, his body limp in the warden's grasp, but his eyes remained coldly calculating. "You were Army, weren't you, Brooks? Dishonorable discharge, if I had to guess. Kabul, maybe. Or was it Kandahar?" Brooks's grip tightened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "How did you—" "Your tattoo." David nodded toward the faded ink visible beneath Brooks's sleeve. 75th Ranger Regiment, but you don't carry yourself like someone who completed the program. Washout? The warden's face contorted with rage. He slammed David back onto the cot. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," David replied. "I know you're on Senator Langston's payroll. I know this facility launders money through inflated supply contracts, and I know you're scared." "Of a cripple?" Brooks scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Of what I represent," David said. Questions. Scrutiny. The end of a very profitable arrangement. Brooks stepped back, composing himself. "Get him cleaned up," he ordered the guards. "General, population today. Let's see how tough he is when he's not protected in isolation." After the warden left, the guards roughly dragged David to the showers, leaving him on the wet floor with a thin prison uniform. One guard muttered, "Better watch your back in Gen Pop, Wheels. They eat guys like you alive." 20 minutes later, David was wheeled into the general population area by a trustee, an older inmate tasked with assisting disabled prisoners. The vast room fell silent as he entered, 200 pairs of eyes assessing the newcomer. David took in the scene with practiced efficiency. Gang territories marked by subtle boundary lines, power dynamics evident in seating arrangements, potential weapons hidden in plain sight. The trustee leaned down, whispering, "They're saying you're a cop." "True?" "Security consultant," David replied. "Same difference to them," the trustee warned, wheeling him to an empty table in the center of the room, the most exposed position possible. David nodded his thanks as the trustee retreated. He remained perfectly still, aware that any sign of fear would mark him as prey. Slowly, conversations resumed around him, though many inmates continued to watch him with predatory interest. It took less than 5 minutes for the first challenge to arrive. A mountain of a man approached, tattoos covering his massive arms and neck. Other inmates cleared a path, confirming his status. Behind him followed 3 equally imposing men, forming a loose semicircle around David's table. "You're in my seat," the leader rumbled, looming over David. David looked up calmly. "Didn't see your name on it." A dangerous silence fell over the room. Even the guards along the wall straightened, sensing trouble. The giant leaned down, placing massive hands on the table. "Name's Big Dre. This whole block belongs to me, and I don't like having cops at my table." "Not a cop," David replied. "Just a guy eating lunch." Big Dre reached out, grabbing the front of David's uniform. "You don't get it, do you? I can end you right here and nobody would blink." In one fluid motion, too fast for most to follow, David's hand shot up, his thumb pressing precisely against a nerve cluster in Big Dre's wrist. The giant's fingers involuntarily released, face contorting in sudden pain. "What the?" Big Dre began, pulling back his hand, finding it temporarily numb. David hadn't moved from his wheelchair, his posture relaxed despite the tension surrounding him. "Like I said, just trying to eat lunch." Big Dre's eyes narrowed, confusion replacing anger. He flexed his hand, feeling returning slowly. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody important," David answered. "But I'm not looking for trouble." Something in David's calm demeanor, the absolute lack of fear, gave Big Dre pause. Men didn't react this way unless they had nothing to lose or were dangerous beyond measure. After a tense moment, Big Dre nodded slightly. "Different table tomorrow," he said, backing away. It wasn't a full retreat, but it was an acknowledgement, respect of a sort. As Big Dre and his entourage moved away, whispers spread through the cafeteria. The newcomer in the wheelchair had faced down the prison's most feared inmate without rising from his seat. The dynamic had shifted. An older inmate slid onto the bench across from David. "That was either the bravest or dumbest thing I've seen in 15 years here," he said quietly. "Sometimes there's not much difference," David replied, finally starting to eat. The man introduced himself as Wilson, a former accountant serving time for embezzlement. "Word is you crossed the wrong cops on the outside. That true?" David considered his response carefully. "Let's just say we had a disagreement about proper police procedure." Wilson leaned closer. "Brooks had 3 trustees cleaning out a special cell in the West Wing this morning. Word is they're preparing it for you." "The West Wing?" David asked, though he suspected the answer. "Where problems disappear," Wilson explained grimly. "Officially, it's administrative segregation, but inmates who go there rarely come back to Gen Pop. Some don't come back at all." David nodded his. "Thanks for the information." The timetable was accelerating. He needed to move his plans forward. That night, locked back in his isolation cell, David began his preparations. With methodical precision, he performed a series of exercises, specialized techniques developed for operatives who might be captured and restrained. His upper body strength, already formidable, was his greatest asset. Outside the jail, a sleek, black sedan with government plates pulled into the visitors' parking lot. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged, carrying a briefcase. At the reception desk, she presented credentials that caused the officer's eyes to widen. "I need to speak with your administrator immediately," Colonel Patricia Harris stated. "It concerns a federal matter." 20 minutes later, she sat across from Sheriff Calloway, whose usually ruddy face had paled considerably. "Let me be clear, Sheriff," Harris said, her voice precise and cold. "David Cole is the subject of an ongoing federal investigation. His presence in your facility is not a coincidence." Calloway shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, Colonel, my detectives arrested Cole on solid evidence." "Fabricated evidence," Harris interrupted. "We both know that, so let's not waste time. That's a serious accusation." "It's a fact documented by multiple surveillance systems," Harris replied. "But that's not why I'm here. Cole remains in your custody for now." Calloway frowned in confusion. "You're not taking him?" "Not yet. Consider this a courtesy visit. A warning, if you will." "A warning about what?" Harris leaned forward slightly. "David Cole is not who you think he is. For your own safety, I recommend improving his conditions immediately and ensuring he comes to no harm while in your custody." "Are you threatening me, Colonel?" Calloway asked, anger overcoming his apprehension. Harris smiled thinly. "Not at all. I'm trying to prevent a massacre." She stood, collecting her briefcase. "You have 24 hours to transfer him to proper medical housing with his wheelchair returned. After that, whatever happens is on your head." As Harris left the office, Calloway immediately reached for his phone, dialing with shaking fingers. "Miller, get to my office now, we have a problem." Meanwhile, in a darkened apartment across town, a figure hunched over multiple computer screens. Known only as Ghost, the hacker's fingers flew across keyboards, bypassing security protocols and firewalls with ease. One monitor displayed the jail's security system, another showed police communications, and a third tracked a GPS location moving through the city. Ghost paused, speaking into an encrypted communication device. The colonel made contact. "Calloway is rattled. Phase 1 complete." A voice responded through the secure channel. "Understood. Maintain surveillance. Phase 2 initiates at 0200 hours. Back in his cell, David lay motionless on his cot, eyes closed but mind active, counting down the hours. Everything was proceeding according to plan. At midnight, 3 guards appeared at his cell door. David recognized them as Brooks's personal enforcers, men chosen for brutality rather than intelligence. "Special delivery for Cole," the lead guard announced with a cruel smile. "Warden wants to make sure you're comfortable." The cell door opened, and the 3 entered. David remained still, apparently asleep. The first guard prodded him roughly with a baton. "Wake up, Wheels. Time for your medicine." David's eyes opened slowly, taking in the situation. 3 guards, batons ready, positioned for maximum intimidation. No cameras in this section of the basement, no witnesses. "Nothing to say?" the guard taunted. "Heard you were a tough guy in the cafeteria today." David spoke softly, almost too quiet to hear. "Last chance to walk away," the guards laughed. "Or what? You'll roll over our toes?" What happened next occurred so quickly that none of the guards could later provide a coherent account. David's hand shot out, grabbing the first guard's baton, and twisting it with such force that the man's wrist snapped audibly. As the guard screamed, David pivoted on the cot, sweeping the second guard's legs from under him with the captured baton. The third guard managed to land a blow to David's shoulder, before David struck with surgical precision, fingers jabbing a nerve cluster that instantly paralyzed the man's right side. Within seconds, all 3 guards lay on the cell floor, one unconscious, one clutching a broken wrist, and one partially paralyzed. David pulled himself into a sitting position, breathing evenly despite the exertion. "I did warn you," he said, to the guard still conscious enough to hear. An hour later, Warden Brooks stormed into the medical unit where his 3 guards were being treated, his face contorted with rage as the doctor described their injuries. "How?" Brooks demanded. "How did a paraplegic take down 3 trained officers?" The guard with the broken wrist shook his head, still dazed. It was like he knew exactly where to hit. One second he was lying there, the next... "I've never seen anything like it, sir." Brooks turned to his deputy. "Move him to the West Wing, now, full restraints, and get me everything we have on his military background." As dawn broke, a cryptic message arrived on the warden's desk. "Do you know who you're holding?" No signature, no return address, just the question printed on plain paper. Brooks crumpled the note, tossing it aside. But doubt had been planted, and for the first time since David's arrival, the warden felt a flicker of unease. In his new cell in the West Wing, a concrete box with no windows and a solid steel door, David sat perfectly still, conserving energy. The chess pieces were moving exactly as he had anticipated. Now it was time for the media to get involved. That morning, every news outlet in the state received an anonymous email containing footage of David's arrest, complete with clear evidence of the detectives planting the gun. By noon, the story had gone viral. By evening, protesters had gathered outside the jail demanding David's release. Sheriff Calloway's phone rang continuously. The mayor, the district attorney, even the governor's office. all demanding explanations. In his office, surrounded by his increasingly nervous deputies, Calloway finally asked the question they'd all been avoiding. Who the hell is David Cole? Rain pounded against the transport vehicle's metal roof as it navigated the winding mountain road. Inside, David Cole sat shackled to his wheelchair, observing the 4 armed guards who watched him nervously. None would meet his gaze directly. 3 weeks had passed since his arrest. The public outcry following the leaked footage had forced the district attorney to formally review the case, but Sheriff Calloway and his corrupt network had pulled strings. Instead of releasing David, they were transferring him to a specialized facility for evaluation. A black site prison hidden in the remote foothills, off the books and away from scrutiny. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the guards' tense faces. David closed his eyes, memories washing over him as the thunder rolled. 10 years earlier, undisclosed location, Middle East gunfire erupted around them as Team Ghost sprinted through the narrow alleyway. What should have been a simple extraction had turned into an ambush, their intelligence compromised, their escape route cut off. "Reynolds! On your 6, David shouted, dropping to one knee and firing 3 precise shots. The pursuing enemy combatant fell, but more were coming. Major James Reynolds, their CIA handler, pressed himself against the crumbling wall. "Phantom, we need an exit." David, known as Phantom to his Delta Force team, scanned their surroundings with preternatural calm. "Ghost, sit rep on the roof access?" A voice crackled through his comms. 2 tangos, northeast corner. I can clear it, but we've got heavy reinforcements incoming from the south. Copy that. Clear it. Team, we're going up and over. David turned to Reynolds. 2 minutes, then we move. Reynolds nodded, checking his weapon. The intel better be worth it. Always is, David replied, reloading. 30 seconds later, their comms crackled again. Roof clear, David signaled the team forward. Move! 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 They ascended quickly, Reynolds bringing up the rear. As they reached the rooftop, David did a final sweep of their 6. The flash of a muzzle in a distant window caught his attention. Sniper, he yelled, lunging toward Reynolds. The impact of the bullet threw David backward, a searing pain erupting in his lower back. He heard shouting, felt hands dragging him across rough concrete, but the world was already fading to black. His last conscious thought was realizing he couldn't feel his legs. Present day. The transport vehicle hit a pothole, jolting David from his memories. The guard across from him was watching with cautious curiosity. You were somewhere else just now, the guard observed. David didn't respond, his face revealing nothing. Not much further, another guard announced, checking his watch. 15 minutes, to handoff. David noted the terminology. Handoff implied he wasn't going to a standard correctional facility. His suspicions were confirmed when the vehicle turned onto an unmarked dirt road, eventually stopping before a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. No signs, no markings, nothing to indicate the facility's purpose or even its existence. As the guards prepared to unload him, David's ears caught the faint sound of an approaching helicopter. The guards didn't seem to notice, focused on their transfer protocols. David allowed himself a small smile, right on time. Meanwhile, in a secure office at the Pentagon, Major James Reynolds stared at his computer screen in disbelief. After years without contact, an alert had triggered in his system, a facial recognition match for David Cole in a police database. Reynolds immediately tried accessing the local police records, but found himself blocked at every turn. Someone with significant clearance was preventing any federal access to information about Cole's case. This doesn't make sense, Reynolds muttered, reaching for his secure phone. Phantom's supposed to be in deep cover. Before he could make the call, his office door opened. A senior official in a dark suit entered without knocking. Major Reynolds, the man said. We need to talk about David Cole. Reynolds straightened. Sir, I just received the alert. I was about to... Do nothing, the man interrupted. This situation is already being handled at the highest levels. With all due respect, sir, Cole was my operative. If he's been compromised, the compromise isn't on Cole's end, the official replied. Someone's using local law enforcement to target him. We believe it's connected to Operation Nightshade. Reynolds paled. Nightshade was buried years ago. All files redacted. All participants either dead or reassigned. Apparently not buried deep enough. The official handed Reynolds a tablet. These are satellite images of the area where Cole is being held. Notice anything? Reynolds studied the images. That's not a standard correctional facility. That's a black site. CIA. Worse. Private military contractors, answering to someone with enough pull to keep federal agencies away. Reynolds set the tablet down, his expression hardening. Cole saved my life. I need to be involved in his extraction. The official shook his head. There's no extraction planned. What? We can't just leave him there. We're not. The official smiled thinly. But Cole isn't the one who needs rescuing. Back at the black site facility, David was wheeled into a stark interrogation room. The walls were bare concrete, a single metal table bolted to the floor in the center. No windows, no cameras, at least none visible. The door opened, and a man in an expensive suit entered. He was tall, military-bearing evident in his posture, though his manicured appearance suggested he hadn't seen combat in years. "Mr. Cole," he said, taking a seat across from David. "My name is Richard Vance. I represent certain interested parties." "Private contractor," David observed. "Blackwater trained, but corporate now. Let me guess. Centaur Security Solutions?" Vance's eyebrow raised slightly. "Very good. Though we prefer to be called Artemis Group these days. Rebranding, you understand." "Mercenaries." "Any other name," David replied evenly. Vance smiled without warmth. "I've been asked to determine exactly what you know about certain operations in Westbrook. Sheriff Calloway seems to think you're a simple security consultant who stumbled onto something beyond your understanding. And what do you think?" "I think," Vance said, leaning forward, "that David Cole's security consultant is a very thin cover identity. What I don't know is who you're really working for." David maintained his neutral expression. "I work for myself." Vance opened a folder on the table. "Your military record shows honorable discharge following injury in Afghanistan. Standard Army, nothing special. Except there are inconsistencies, gaps, missions that don't align with your unit's documented deployments." Vance studied David carefully. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to create this background. Maybe I'm just a wounded vet trying to make a living," David suggested. Vance laughed. "A wounded vet who disabled 3 trained guards without leaving. His bed? Who knows pressure points that aren't taught outside of specialized units? No, Mr. Cole, you're something else entirely." Outside the facility, Ghost monitored the situation from a concealed position in the surrounding forest. Through high-powered surveillance equipment, he tracked heat signatures moving within the compound. "Target is in the main building, East Wing," Ghost reported into his secure comms. 4 guards at the perimeter, 2 at each entrance. Unknown. "Number inside. Copy that," came the response. "Diversion in 3 minutes. Be ready." Ghost checked his watch and then the sky. The approaching storm would provide additional cover. Inside the interrogation room, Vance circled the table, his initial politeness giving way to frustration as David continued to deflect his questions. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," Vance said. "Senator Langston simply wants to know what you've discovered about his operations and who you've told." "Senator Langston," David repeated. "Interesting that you'd mention him directly." Vance realized his mistake too late. "I simply meant—" "You meant exactly what you said," David interrupted. "The senator is directly involved in Westbrook's corruption. Thank you for confirming that." Vance's expression darkened. "You won't be sharing that information with anyone." "Too late," David replied calmly. "Everything I know is backed up and encrypted the moment Detective Miller targeted me. If I don't check in regularly, it all goes public automatically." "You're bluffing, am I?" David smiled slightly. "Why do you think the footage of my arrest leaked? That was just a sample." Vance studied him for a long moment before pressing an intercom button. "Bring in the specialist." The door opened and 2 guards entered, followed by a slight man carrying a medical bag. The man's cold, clinical demeanor immediately identified him to David, an interrogation specialist, euphemism for torturer. Mr. Cole refuses to cooperate. Voluntarily, Vance explained to the newcomer. Perhaps you can persuade him. The specialist nodded, opening his bag to reveal an array of syringes and pharmaceutical vials. This won't take long, he said in a surprisingly soft voice. The new compounds are quite effective, even on those with resistance training. As he prepared the first injection, a distant explosion rocked the building. Alarms immediately began. Blaring throughout the facility, Vance rushed to the door. What the hell was that? One of the guards received a message through his radio. Sir, we're under attack. Multiple explosions at the perimeter. Secure the prisoner, Vance ordered before hurrying out. The specialist and remaining guard looked uncertainly at David, who sat calmly in his wheelchair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Something funny? The guard demanded. Just timing, David replied. The facility's lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, emergency lighting casting red shadows across the room. Through the walls came the distant popping of gunfire. The specialist hastily packed his equipment. We need to move him to a secure location. The guard nodded, moving behind David's wheelchair. I'll take him to the panic room in the West Wing. As the guard leaned down to release the wheelchair's brakes, David made his move. With lightning speed, he grabbed the guard's arm, using the man's own momentum to pull him forward and off balance. The specialist lunged forward with a syringe, but David deflected his arm, sending the needle into the guard's neck instead. The guard collapsed instantly, the powerful sedative taking immediate effect. The specialist backed away in shock, reaching for another syringe. David wheeled forward rapidly, ramming into the man's legs and sending him sprawling onto the metal table. Before he could recover, David delivered a precise strike to the base of his skull, rendering him unconscious. David quickly searched both men, finding a keycard and a handgun. He checked the weapon, confirmed it was loaded, and tucked it into his waistband. The explosion and power outage were right on schedule. Ghost always was punctual with his distractions. In the corridor outside, chaos reigned. Guards ran in both directions, none paying attention to a man in a wheelchair emerging from the interrogation room. David navigated with purpose, heading not toward an exit, but deeper into the facility. He needed to find the evidence, the connection between Senator Langston and this black site. As David rounded a corner, he encountered two guards escorting a frightened civilian, a young man in wire-rimmed glasses clutching a laptop. The servers, one guard was shouting. Secure the servers first. David recognized an opportunity. The young man was clearly the facility's IT specialist. Following at a distance, David tracked them to a secure server room in the heart of the building. Outside, the diversionary attack continued, drawing most of the security forces to the perimeter. Inside, David waited patiently as the IT specialist frantically worked to secure the facility's data. When one guard left to check on another area, David made his move. The remaining guard never saw the blow coming. One moment he was standing watch, the next he was unconscious on the floor. The IT specialist turned in horror, raising his hands in surrender. Please don't hurt me. I'm just doing my job. David wheeled closer. Your job is protecting Senator Langston's illegal operations. The young man's eyes widened. I don't know anything about that. I just maintain the systems. Then you won't mind giving me access to those systems, David replied, gesturing to the computers with his gun. 10 minutes later, David had everything he needed. Financial records, communications, operational plans, all documenting the extensive corruption network centered around Senator Langston. As the IT specialist watched in terrified silence, David transferred the data to a secure device. What happens now? The young man asked as David finished. Now you make a choice, David replied. Stay and be part of this, or leave and save yourself. The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. David handed the young man a small card. If you choose to leave, contact this number. They can help you disappear. The IT specialist stared at the card, then nodded once before fleeing through a side door. David wheeled himself into a shadowed alcove and waited. Vance burst into the server room seconds later, followed by 4 heavily armed guards. Where is he? Vance demanded, seeing the unconscious guard on the floor. As the guard spread out to search, David slipped away through the same side door the IT specialist had used. The corridor led to a service elevator, perfect for his escape. Outside the ICE facility, a fierce firefight continued. Ghost's diversion had escalated into a full-scale assault, with unknown forces engaging the Black Site's security team. Amid the chaos, a military helicopter approached from the east, flying dangerously low to avoid detection. David reached the facility's lower level, where a loading dock provided potential escape routes. As he approached the exit, he heard the distinctive click of a weapon being cocked behind him. "That's far enough, Cole." David turned to find Detective Miller, pistol trained on his chest. The detective looked haggard, eyes wild with fear and desperation. "Miller," David acknowledged, calmly. "Didn't expect to see you here?" "Shut up," Miller snarled. "You've ruined everything. Do you have any idea what they'll do to me when they find out I lost control of this situation?" "They already know," David replied. "Langston's cutting his losses as we speak." Miller's hand trembled slightly. "I can still fix this. Your body will be found in the aftermath of this attack. A tragic casualty." David didn't flinch. "Is that really how you want this to end? You're a corrupt cop, Miller, not a murderer." "You don't know what I am," Miller shouted. "I know you joined the force to make a difference," David said, his voice steady. "I know corruption is like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink, and I know you have a choice right now." Something in David's words seemed to reach Miller. The detective's aim wavered. "It's too late for me," he said, voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. "It's not," David countered. "Testify against Langston. Tell the truth about what's been happening in Westbrook." Miller lowered his gun slightly. "They'll kill me." "Not if you're under federal protection." A tremendous explosion rocked the building, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. The facility was coming apart. "Make your choice, detective," David urged, "but make it now." Miller stared at David for a long moment before slowly holstering his weapon. "What happens next?" Before David could answer, the loading dock door burst open. A tactical team in unmarked black fatigues stormed in, weapons at the ready. "On the ground," they shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Miller dropped to his knees, hands raised. David remained in his wheelchair, studying the team's movements. These weren't Vance's men. Their discipline and coordination spoke of formal military training. The team leader approached David. "Phantom," he said quietly. "Major Reynolds sends his regards." David nodded in recognition. "About time you showed up." "Extraction is on the roof," the leader continued. "We need to move now." As they prepared to leave, David gestured to Miller. "He comes too. He has information we need." The team leader hesitated but eventually nodded. Two operators secured Miller while others formed a protective formation around David. Together, they moved toward the stairwell that would lead them to the roof and the waiting helicopter. Outside, Ghost watched through his binoculars as the helicopter touched down on the facility's roof. When he saw David being loaded aboard, he spoke into his comms device. "Package secure. Begin withdrawal." The diversionary forces began to pull back, their mission accomplished. As the helicopter rose into the stormy sky, Ghost packed his equipment and melted into the forest. His part in this operation was complete, but the war against corruption in Westbrook was just beginning. Aboard the helicopter, David secured himself as they accelerated away from the burning facility. Across from him, Miller sat in stunned silence, still processing the events of the past hour. A secure phone was passed to David. On the other end, a familiar voice greeted him. "Phantom," Major Reynolds said. "Welcome back to the land of the living." "Never left," David replied. "Just working from a different angle." "We have a lot to discuss," Reynolds continued, "especially about Senator Langston's operation." David glanced at the secured data device containing everything he'd downloaded from the facility's servers. "I have everything we need to burn it all down." As the helicopter banked east, David looked out at the storm clouds breaking apart, revealing patches of clear sky. Phase 1 of his mission was complete. Now came the real war. exposing the truth and bringing down a corruption network that reached to the highest levels of power. Miller leaned forward in his seat. "Where are we going?" David turned to him. "Somewhere safe. For now." The detective nodded slowly, the reality of his new status as a federal witness beginning to sink in. In the distance, the lights of Westbrook twinkled against the darkening landscape. David's thoughts turned to the next phase of his plan. Senator Langston would be scrambling now, trying to cover his tracks and eliminate loose ends. The game had changed, but the mission remained the same. Justice, by any means necessary. Rain pounded against the safe house windows as David Cole studied the information displayed on the multiple screens before him. 3 days had passed since the helicopter extraction from the black site. The safe house, a modernized cabin tucked away in the mountains 40 miles outside Westbrook, now served as his command center. David's wheelchair glided silently across the polished concrete floor as he moved between workstations. His physical therapist had delivered a custom tactical chair that morning. Reinforced titanium frame, puncture-proof tires, and several hidden compartments for equipment. It felt good to have proper mobility again. "Miller's statement is paying dividends," Major Reynolds said, entering the room with a tablet in hand. The CIA handler looked much the same as he had years ago, trim, efficient, with the perpetually alert expression of someone who had seen too much to ever fully relax. David took the tablet, scanning the information. "The FBI's moving on this?" "Cautiously," Reynolds replied. "Langston has friends in Washington, but your evidence combined with Miller's testimony has forced their hand. They've opened a formal investigation." "Too slow," David said, handing back the tablet. "Langston's already cleaning house." As if to confirm his assessment, a new alert appeared on one of the screens. Ghost's digitally distorted voice filled the room through the speakers. "Phantom, are you receiving?" "Go ahead, Ghost," David replied. Detective Slade was just found, dead in his apartment. Official cause is suicide, but the scene looks staged. Single gunshot wound to the head, no powder residue on his hands. David exchanged a glance with Reynolds. "Langston's tying up loose ends." "There's more," Ghost continued. "Sheriff Calloway has gone dark, hasn't reported to the station in 48 hours, and I've intercepted communication suggesting a hit team is being assembled. Elite contractors, former special forces." "Target?" David asked. "You." Reynolds moved to a secure phone. "I'll arrange additional security for this location." David shook his head. "No, this is exactly what we need." "You want them to find you?" Reynolds asked incredulously. "I want them to try," David corrected. "Every mercenary Langston sends is another thread connecting back to him. Evidence we can use." Reynolds studied his former operative with concern. "This isn't a sanctioned operation, Phantom. You don't have to put yourself at risk." David wheeled toward the window, looking out at the storm-lashed forest. "They dragged me from my bed, humiliated me, denied me medical care, and tried to break me." His voice remained calm, but Reynolds recognized the cold fury beneath. "This became personal the moment Miller and Slade decided to make an example of me." Before Reynolds could respond, the cabin door opened. Detective Miller entered, looking haggard but more composed than he had on the helicopter. 3 days of debriefings had taken their toll, but there was a new clarity in his eyes, the look of a man who had made a difficult but necessary choice. "Slade's dead," Miller said without preamble. "We heard," David replied. "You're not surprised?" Miller shook his head. "Calloway called me yesterday, wanted to meet, said he had a way to fix this mess. I didn't go." "Smart move," Reynolds commented. "They're hunting anyone who might talk," Miller continued. "There's a list. I was on it. So are at least 6 other officers who know too much." David turned from the window. "And now they're hunting me." "Not just you," Miller corrected. "Anyone connected to you. Your assistant at the security firm, Alicia. Her apartment was broken into last night. She wasn't home." David's expression hardened. "Where is she now?" "Federal protection," Reynolds interjected. "We moved her the moment we heard you'd been taken to the black site. She's safe. David nodded his thanks, then wheeled to the central computer station. Ghost, are you still with us? Always, came the distorted reply. I need everything on the hit team. Identities, movements, contractors. Working on it, Ghost replied. But there's something else you should see. Sending to your screen now. A video feed appeared showing a warehouse on the outskirts of Westbrook. Several vehicles were parked outside, black SUVs with tinted windows and no license plates. This is live? David asked. Yes. Thermal imaging shows at least 12 armed individuals inside. They're preparing for something big. David studied the layout, memories of countless operations flowing through his mind. That's not just a hit team, that's an assault force. Reynolds moved closer to the screen. The warehouse is registered to a subsidiary of Artemis Group, Vance's company. Langston's getting desperate, David observed. He's escalating from covert operations to open warfare. Miller looked between the two men. What's the play? David's expression shifted to one Miller hadn't seen before. The cold, calculating focus of a Delta Force operative planning a mission. We strike first. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Despite Reynolds' objections, David insisted on leading the operation personally. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about sending a message. Night fell over Westbrook as David positioned himself on a small ridge overlooking the warehouse. Through high-powered binoculars, he observed the mercenaries' movements, identifying patterns and weaknesses. He wore tactical gear adapted for his wheelchair, with specialized equipment designed during his Delta Force days. Team 1 in position, came Ghost's voice through his earpiece. Team 2 ready, Reynolds confirmed from his position on the opposite side of the warehouse. David keyed his mic. Remember, non-lethal takedowns only. We need them alive for questioning. Copy that, both teams acknowledged. David took a deep sigh of breath, centered himself, and gave the order. Execute. The operation unfolded with military precision. Team 1, led by Ghost, cut power to the warehouse. Team 2 deployed flashbang grenades through skylights. As confusion erupted inside, David activated the wheelchair's specialized motor, descending the ridge with surprising speed and silence. He reached the rear entrance just as the first mercenaries stumbled out, disoriented from the flashbangs. With practiced efficiency, David deployed a compressed air launcher mounted to his wheelchair, firing non-lethal projectiles that struck with pinpoint accuracy. 2 men went down immediately, incapacitated but alive. Inside the warehouse, Ghost's team moved like shadows, systematically neutralizing threats. Reynolds coordinated from the perimeter, ensuring no one escaped. It was over in less than 10 minutes. 12 highly trained mercenaries subdued without a single fatality. David wheeled through the main warehouse space, surveying their handiwork. The mercenaries lay zip-tied and secured, their arsenal of weapons, neatly stacked and cataloged as evidence. Ghost, David called. What have we got? A figure emerged from the shadows, face obscured by a tactical mask, identity protected as always. Ghost handed David a tablet. Their operational plans. They were going to hit the safe house tomorrow at dawn. Full assault, no survivors. David scrolled through the information. Payment authorizations? Routed through shells but sloppy. We can trace it back to Langston with the right pressure. Reynolds joined them, removing his tactical helmet. FBI is 15 minutes out. We need to be gone before they arrive. David nodded, then wheeled toward the mercenary who appeared to be the team leader. The man glared up from the floor, defiance in his eyes despite his predicament. Who sent you? David asked, though he already knew the answer. The mercenary spat. Go to hell. David leaned forward slightly. You were Special Forces once, 5th Group, judging by your tactics. You took an oath to defend this country against enemies foreign and domestic. Something flickered in the man's eyes. You know who I am, David continued. You know what I was, so you know I'm giving you one chance to remember that oath. Senator Langston is using you to cover up corruption that goes against everything you once stood for. The mercenary's expression wavered. The FBI will be here soon, David said. Whoever, Talks first gets the best deal. He wheeled away, leaving the seed planted. Behind him, he heard the mercenary call out, "Wait, I want to talk." Outside, as they prepared to depart before the FBI arrived, Reynolds approached David. "Impressive work, just like old times." David shook his head. "Not like old times. Back then, we would have eliminated the threat and disappeared. This is different." "How so?" "We're not in the shadows anymore," David replied. "This isn't about covert operations. It's about justice in the light of day." As they vanished into the night, news helicopters appeared on the horizon, drawn by anonymous tips about a major law enforcement operation. By morning, the raid would be headline news across the country, another piece of the puzzle becoming public, another blow to Senator Langston's crumbling empire. Senator William Langston paced the plush carpet of his private office, a tumbler of expensive bourbon clutched in his trembling hand. The morning news played on mute on a large wall-mounted screen, footage of FBI agents leading away the mercenaries captured at the warehouse the night before. "This is a disaster," Langston hissed to the man seated across from him. Richard Vance remained outwardly calm, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. 12 of your best men captured, singing like canaries to the feds." "They're contractors, not my men," Vance corrected. "And they don't know enough to connect this directly to you." "Don't patronize me." Langston slammed the tumbler down, bourbon sloshing over the rim. First, Miller turns witness, then the warehouse raid. Now this morning's leak about offshore. Accounts? Someone is systematically dismantling everything we've built. Vance leaned forward. "It's Cole. Everything leads back to him." "Cole is one man in a wheelchair," Langston said through clenched teeth. "A man who was Delta Force," Vance replied. "I've confirmed it. David Cole is actually Captain David Cole, call sign Phantom, one of the most lethal operatives the program ever produced before his injury." Langston sank into his chair. "Why wasn't this in his file when we targeted him?" "Because someone very high up redacted it," Vance explained. "Cole was involved in classified operations that never officially happened. After his injury, he was given a new identity and background." The senator cursed under his breath. "Can we still contain this?" "The warehouse team is compromised. Calloway has disappeared, probably cut a deal. The offshore accounts are being frozen as we speak." Vance spread his hands. "We need to consider strategic withdrawal." "You mean run?" Langston's face flushed with anger. "I've spent 20 years building my position. I'm not abandoning everything because of one man." Vance's expression hardened. "Then we eliminate him, not with teams or indirect methods. Clean, simple, professional. You have someone who can handle this?" "I've already made the call. He arrives tonight." Langston nodded slowly, composure returning. "Good. And what about our meeting with Ramirez?" "Still on for tonight. The cartel needs reassurance that our distribution network remains intact despite these disruptions." "Make sure Ramirez understands this is a temporary setback," Langston instructed. "We'll weather this storm like all the others." As Vance left the office, Langston turned to the window, gazing out at the city he'd corrupted from within. For 20 years, he'd built his power base in Westbrook, using the police as his enforcers, channeling cartel money through legitimate businesses, blackmailing officials, and eliminating threats. One man would not destroy that legacy. Across town, in a modest hotel room converted into a temporary operations center, David reviewed the latest intelligence with Ghost and Reynolds. The information flowed in a constant stream: financial records, police reports, witness statements, all painting a damning picture of corruption that reached from the streets of Westbrook to the highest levels of state government. "Langston's scheduled a meeting tonight," Ghost reported, indicating a message intercepted from Vance's encrypted communications. "High level. Location is the old Carson paper mill outside town." David studied the building schematics Ghost had pulled up. "Who's attending?" "Langston, Vance, and someone identified only as R, based on previous communications. Likely Miguel Ramirez, regional cartel lieutenant." Reynolds whistled softly. "Cartel connection confirmed. This gets better by the minute." "What's our approach?" Ghost asked. "Surveillance only, or do we move on this?" David considered the options. We need concrete evidence of Langston meeting with Ramirez. Video, audio, something that can't be explained away by his lawyers. FBI won't move without it. Reynolds agreed. Too much political pressure to back off. Then we get it, David said decisively. Ghost, prepare surveillance equipment. Reynolds, coordinate with your federal contacts. Have them ready to move once we deliver the evidence. As they prepared for the evening operation, David wheeled to the window, looking out at the afternoon sun slanting across the city. The constant movement helped him think, kept his tactical mind sharp. You're taking this very personally, Reynolds observed, joining him at the window. Aren't you? David countered. 20 years in the field, fighting threats overseas, while people like Langston destroy communities from within. Reynolds nodded, slowly. Fair point, but there's something else, isn't there? David was silent for a moment. When I was in that cell, no wheelchair, no dignity, guards thinking they could break me because of my disability. I realized something. There are men with broken moral compasses doing more damage than any terrorist cell we ever hunted. And you appointed yourself to stop them. Someone has to, David replied simply. Night fell as they took up positions around the old paper mill. David positioned himself in an elevated section of the adjacent building, where a partially collapsed wall offered both cover and a clear view of the mill's main entrance. Ghost had rigged the area with directional microphones and hidden cameras, while Reynolds coordinated from their mobile command center 2 blocks away. Target vehicles approaching, Ghost's voice reported through the comms. 3 SUVs, matching the description from Langston's security detail. David adjusted his position, training high-powered binoculars on the convoy as it pulled up to the mill. Langston emerged from the middle vehicle, flanked by bodyguards. Vance followed, scanning the surroundings with professional vigilance. Second convoy approaching from the south, Reynolds reported. Likely Ramirez. David watched as 3 more vehicles arrived. The security procedures were elaborate. Men checking the building, sweeping for surveillance, establishing a perimeter. Finally, a man emerged from the lead SUV, Miguel Ramirez, the cartel's representative. We have visual confirmation, David reported, initiating recording. Inside the mill, Langston, Vance, and Ramirez gathered around a makeshift conference table, their security teams maintaining a respectful distance. Ghost's equipment captured every word with crystal clarity. My organization is concerned, Ramirez began without preamble. 3 shipments intercepted in 2 weeks. FBI suddenly interested in our distribution routes. This does not inspire confidence, Senator. Langston spread his hands placatingly. A temporary situation, I assure you. We've had an internal security breach, but it's being handled. The raid on your warehouse suggests otherwise, Ramirez replied coldly. A setback, Vance interjected. But we've identified the source of the problem. By this time tomorrow, David, coal will no longer be an issue. Ramirez looked skeptical. This one man has caused so much trouble. He had help, Langston admitted reluctantly. Federal connections. But once he's eliminated, our mutual interests will be secure again. The conversation continued, detailing money laundering operations, drug distribution networks, and planned shipments. With every word, they incriminated themselves further. This is perfect, Reynolds whispered through the comms. Absolutely perfect. David was about to respond when his instincts flared. Something was wrong. The security pattern had shifted. One of Langston's men had disappeared from view. Ghost, check your 6, David warned. The shot came from nowhere. A high-powered rifle round that shattered a section of wall inches from David's position. He reacted instantly, dropping flat as more bullets followed. Sniper, David reported, wheeling himself backward into better cover. Northeast rooftop, approximately 400 meters. Moving to intercept, Ghost responded immediately. Reynolds' voice crackled through the comms. David, the meeting is breaking up. They heard the shots. Inside the mill, chaos erupted. Ramirez's security team hustled him toward his vehicles while Langston demanded explanations from Vance. I thought you said this location was secure, the senator shouted. It was, Vance insisted, drawing his sidearm. This is something else. We need to leave, Now, as they rushed for the exit, the main doors burst open. FBI tactical teams poured in, weapons raised, shouting commands. Ramirez's men reached for their weapons, but were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. FBI, everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. Langston froze in disbelief, watching as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. Ramirez was already being handcuffed, the cartel lieutenant's face a mask of fury. Vance assessed the situation and made a break for a side exit, only to be cut off by more agents. Outside, David had identified the sniper's position and was relaying coordinates to Ghost. Professional job, likely military background, careful on approach. Already, in position, Ghost replied. Target is, wait, he's moving, he's abandoning the position. The sniper, Vance's professional solution, had recognized the FBI's arrival and was making a strategic withdrawal. For him, it was just another failed contract, not worth dying over. David wheeled himself to a better vantage point to observe the operation's conclusion. FBI agents led Langston, Vance, and Ramirez from the building in handcuffs, loading them into separate vehicles. The senator's face was contorted with rage and disbelief, scanning the surroundings as if looking for someone to blame. For a brief moment, his eyes seemed to meet David's across the distance, recognition and hatred flashing in his gaze before he was pushed into an FBI transport. Reynolds joined David as the vehicles pulled away. We did it. 3 major players in custody, documented meeting with the cartel, financial records to back it all up. This case is airtight. David nodded, but his expression remained solemn. It's not over. What do you mean? We've got Langston, Vance, and a cartel lieutenant all in custody. Langston's network is extensive, David explained. Political allies, judges, business partners, people who benefited from his corruption but kept their hands clean enough to deny involvement. 1 battle at a time, Reynolds advised. Tonight was a major victory. David acknowledged this with a slight nod. What about Sheriff Calloway? Still missing, Reynolds replied. But with tonight's arrests, he's more valuable as a witness than a target. He'll surface eventually. As they prepared to leave, Ghost's voice came through the comms one final time. For the night. Phantom, you should know, our facial recognition scan identified someone interesting at Langston's office earlier today. Sending the image now. David checked his secure phone, studying the grainy security camera image. His expression darkened. Problem? Reynolds asked. The man entering Langston's building, David said, showing Reynolds the image. That's Judge Marshall Hayden. Reynolds squinted at the screen. The federal judge overseeing the Westbrook corruption investigation? David nodded grimly. Like I said, it's not over. Langston's network runs deeper than we thought. As they departed, the scene leaving FBI teams to process evidence and secure the area, David's mind was already working on the next phase. The corrupt senator and his immediate associates might be in custody, but the system that enabled them remained intact. The war on corruption had only just begun. Behind them, the city of Westbrook glittered in the darkness, its surface beauty, concealing the corruption that had festered beneath for decades. But something had changed tonight. A reckoning had begun, and David Cole, once dismissed as a helpless man in a wheelchair, had proven to be the catalyst for justice that the city desperately needed. Dusk settled over the abandoned military compound 20 miles outside Westbrook. The facility, once a training ground for special operations units, had been decommissioned years ago, its existence erased from public records. Now, its crumbling buildings and overgrown parade grounds served as the perfect battlefield for David Cole's final confrontation. 3 weeks had passed since Senator Langston's arrest. The politician had been denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to his extensive overseas connections and the severity of the charges against him. But Langston's reach extended far beyond prison walls. His organization, wounded but not destroyed, had regrouped under the leadership of his son, Michael Langston, a former intelligence contractor with his father's ambition and none of his restraint. David surveyed the compound through high-powered binoculars from his position in the derelict command center. Ghost's intelligence had been precise as always. Michael Langston had assembled an elite mercenary team for one purpose: eliminating David Cole and anyone else who could testify against his father. Perimeter sensors are active, Ghost reported, monitoring multiple screens from their makeshift command post. Motion detectors, thermal imaging, sound recognition, all operational. David nodded, wheeling himself to the tactical map they'd prepared. And our countermeasures? In place, Reynolds confirmed, checking his weapon. Remote detonators, smoke dispensers, specialized minefields, just as you specified. They're coming in force, Ghost added, pointing to satellite imagery on his primary screen. 3 vehicles approaching from the south, 2 more from the east. Professional formation, maintaining communication discipline. David studied the incoming threat with the calm assessment of a seasoned tactician. Approximately 15 operators based on vehicle capacity. Likely 2 sniper teams, 3 assault squads, and command elements. Plus Vega, Reynolds added grimly. Our surveillance picked him up meeting with Michael Langston yesterday. Good, David replied. I was hoping he'd come. The plan had been meticulously crafted over the past week. When Michael Langston's intelligence network detected David's apparent hideout at the abandoned compound, it wasn't by accident. David had deliberately leaked his location, creating the perfect trap. The compound's layout, a maze of bunkers, training facilities, and administrative buildings, provided endless tactical advantages for someone who knew how to use them. They'll establish a perimeter first, David explained, indicating key positions on the map. Standard procedure for an operation this size. Sniper teams will take elevated positions here and here. He pointed to 2 decrepit watchtowers. Assault teams will advance from multiple angles, attempting to flush us toward their blocking forces. And our response? Reynolds asked. We let them deploy completely, David replied. Once they commit their resources, we control the engagement. Ghost checked his watch. ETA 12 minutes based on their current speed. David wheeled himself to the equipment table, where his specialized gear waited. The wheelchair he used now was unlike any medical device, a combat-optimized vehicle with reinforced frame, tactical attachments, and multiple hidden compartments for weapons and equipment. Remember, David instructed as they prepared, this isn't about killing them, it's about exposing them. Every mercenary captured alive is evidence against Michael Langston. Reynolds nodded, understanding the strategy. They weren't just fighting mercenaries. They were building a case that would dismantle the entire Langston operation, root and branch. As darkness fell, David positioned himself in the central administration building, a 3-story concrete structure with multiple access points and clear sightlines to the surrounding area. Reynolds took up position in an adjacent bunker, while Ghost monitored everything from their secure command post. First vehicles stopping at the south entrance, Ghost reported through their comms. Teams deploying. David watched through night vision, equipment as black-clad figures moved with military precision, establishing security positions and beginning their methodical approach. Their tactics were textbook special operations, exactly what David had anticipated. Snipers moving to the watchtowers, Ghost continued. Exactly as you predicted. David smiled slightly. Activate countermeasures Alpha and Delta. Across the compound, carefully concealed devices sprang to life. Specialized jammers disrupted the mercenaries' communications, while infrared emitters created false heat signatures, confusing their thermal imaging systems. The first layer of David's trap was sprung. The response was immediate. Hand signals, replacing radio communication, team leaders adapting to the electronic interference. David noted their professionalism with grudging respect. These weren't ordinary mercenaries, they were former Special Forces operators from various military backgrounds. Assault teams approaching the main building, Ghost updated. 3-man teams, covering formations. Reynolds, David said calmly. Execute Phase 2. From his position, Reynolds activated a series of remote detonators. Across the compound, controlled explosions sent debris and dust clouds into the air. No shrapnel, no casualties, just strategic confusion. The mercenary teams immediately dropped to defensive positions, their formation disrupted. In the chaos, David made his move. Using pre-established routes, he navigated through the building's lower level, emerging behind the nearest assault team. With precision strikes from specialized, non-lethal weapons, he neutralized 2 operators before they registered his presence. The third turned in time to see David, a man in a wheelchair, moving with lethal efficiency, but had no opportunity to react before a dart from David's modified weapon delivered a fast-acting sedative. "First team down," David reported quietly, moving to position Bravo. As David navigated through the shadows, Reynolds engaged another team approaching from the east. The former CIA handler might not have David's specialized training, but decades of field experience made him a formidable opponent. Using the compound's architecture to his advantage, Reynolds isolated and neutralized targets with methodical precision. "Ghost. Status on sniper teams?" David requested. "Both in position." Ghost replied. "Activate countermeasure Echo." On the watchtowers, the snipers suddenly found their positions compromised as pre-planted devices released specialized smoke compounds. Not harmful, but dense enough to render their vantage points useless. For the next 40 minutes, David and Reynolds systematically dismantled the mercenary force. Each engagement was carefully controlled, disabling rather than killing, capturing rather than eliminating. With Ghost's constant surveillance providing tactical advantage, they maneuvered their opponents into prepared traps and ambush points. 7 operators secured, Reynolds reported after neutralizing another team. 3 more retreating toward the vehicle staging area. "They're adapting," David observed. "Ghost, any sign of Vega?" "Negative. Wait." Ghost paused, his voice sharpening. "New thermal signature entering from the north. Moving too carefully to be detected by standard sensors. Has to be Vega." David had been waiting for this. Anton Vega was too experienced to commit himself until he understood the tactical situation. Now, with most of his force neutralized, the master assassin was finally entering the field personally. "Reynolds, secure the prisoners," David ordered. "I'll handle Vega." "Alone?" Reynolds questioned. "That's not the plan." "Plans adapt," David replied simply. "Ghost will guide you to extraction point Charlie. I'll meet you at the rendezvous." Despite Reynolds' objections, David knew this confrontation had to be one-on-one. Vega was too dangerous, too skilled to approach with anything less than full focus. This wasn't just about capturing another mercenary. It was about eliminating the most immediate threat to their entire operation. David positioned himself in the compound's old training hall, a cavernous space with multiple levels, catwalks, and shadowed alcoves. The wheelchaired fighter didn't seek concealment. Instead, he waited in the center of the room, a single beam of moonlight from the damaged roof illuminating his position. "I know you're here, Vega," David called, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Let's finish what we started." For several moments, only silence answered him. Then, from the shadows, Anton Vega emerged. The assassin moved with predatory grace, his expression betraying neither anger nor concern despite his decimated force. "Impressive work, Cole," Vega acknowledged, stopping just outside the circle of moonlight. "You've cost my employer several $1 million in operational assets tonight." "Your employer is finished," David replied. "Senator Langston will die in prison. His son will join him once we link him to this assassination attempt." Vega shrugged slightly. "Perhaps, but the Langstons are merely clients. There will always be others willing to pay for my services." "Not after tonight," the 2 men assessed, each other with the calculated awareness of apex predators. David noted Vega's stance, the slight favoring of his right side, the specialized weapons visible and those likely concealed. Vega studied David's wheelchair, looking for weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the man's condition. "I've researched you more thoroughly since our last encounter," Vega said, circling slowly. "Operation Phantom, Delta Force's ghost operative. The man who completed 17 impossible missions before taking a bullet that should have killed him." "You shouldn't believe everything in classified files," David replied, tracking Vega's movement. "They tend to exaggerate." "Do they?" Vega smiled coldly. "Because the man I've witnessed these past weeks lives up to the legend. I've never seen anyone accomplish so much from a wheelchair. The chair is irrelevant, David said. It's the man that matters. Indeed. Vega's hand moved with blinding speed, drawing and firing in a single fluid motion. David was already moving, his wheelchair pivoting as the bullet passed through the space he had occupied a split second earlier. His response was equally swift. A specialized projectile fired from a concealed weapon in his chair's armrest. Vega dodged, but not completely. The projectile grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric and drawing a thin line of blood. His expression registered surprise, not at being hit, but at the speed of David's response. What followed was a deadly dance between two master combatants. Vega utilized the training hall's multiple levels, moving rapidly between positions, firing with precision from unexpected angles. David countered with remarkable mobility, his wheelchair becoming an asset rather than a limitation as he executed maneuvers no standing opponent would anticipate. "You know we're evenly matched," Vega called after several minutes of inconclusive exchange. "This could go on for hours." "I have time," David replied calmly, reloading his specialized weapon. "Your reinforcements aren't coming, and every minute you spend here, evidence against Michael Langston grows stronger." Vega paused, considering this. "What are you proposing?" "Walk away," David suggested. "There's no profit for you here. The Langstons can't pay you if they're in prison." For a moment, it seemed Vega might consider the offer. Then, with snake-like quickness, he launched himself from an overhead catwalk, firing 3 precisely aimed shots as he descended. David pivoted and accelerated, bullets striking his wheelchair's reinforced back as he took cover behind a concrete pillar. He emerged on the other side, firing 2 shots of his own that forced Vega to roll behind a fallen section of wall. "You misunderstand my position," Vega called out. "This is no longer about payment. This is professional pride. No target has ever escaped me twice." "First time for everything," David replied, maneuvering to a new position. The confrontation intensified, both men expending resources and endurance as they sought advantage. Despite his wheelchair, David showed no signs of fatigue, his upper body strength and tactical awareness compensating for his immobility. Vega, despite his full physical capabilities, found himself increasingly frustrated by an opponent who defied conventional combat dynamics. The decisive moment came 15 minutes into their battle. Vega, attempting to gain higher ground, mounted a partially collapsed staircase. David had anticipated this move, having mapped every potential path through the training hall. A precisely timed shot struck the weakened support beneath Vega's position. The staircase gave way, sending the assassin crashing to the floor below. Though Vega rolled to absorb the impact, the fall dislocated his shoulder and sent his primary weapon skittering across the concrete. Before he could recover, David was upon him, wheelchair brakes locked as he launched himself at his opponent. They grappled briefly, Vega's injured shoulder hampering his defense. With surgical precision, David applied pressure to specific nerve clusters, paralyzing Vega's right side. "Temporary," David explained, as Vega struggled against the invisible restraint. "The feeling will return in approximately 6 hours. By then, you'll be in federal custody." Vega, immobilized but defiant, managed a pained smile. "You think this ends with me? With the Langstons? They're small players in a much larger game." "I'm counting on it," David replied, securing Vega with specialized restraints. "You're going to tell me everything about that larger game." Outside the training hall, Reynolds had completed the prisoner transfer. 15 mercenaries and their equipment were now in federal custody, along with communication devices containing direct links to Michael Langston. The evidence was irrefutable. "Ghost," David called through his comm unit. "Status report." "Federal teams have Michael Langston in custody," Ghost responded. "They caught him trying to board a private jet at the regional airport. His phones and computers have been seized. And the data package? Successfully delivered to all targeted agencies and media outlets. The full extent of the Langston operation is now public knowledge." David nodded with satisfaction as he secured the still paralyzed Vega to his transport device. Mission complete. Proceeding to extraction point. As dawn broke over the abandoned military compound, Federal agents swarmed the area, documenting the night's events and collecting additional evidence. David Cole, the man they had come to call the Phantom, watched from a distance as his carefully orchestrated plan reached its conclusion. Reynolds approached, offering a secure satellite phone. "It's the director. He wants to speak with you, personally." David accepted the phone, listening more than speaking as the highest levels of government acknowledged his service. When the call ended, he turned to Reynolds with a rare smile. "They're expanding the investigation," David explained. "The Langston case has exposed corruption networks in 3 additional states." Reynolds nodded. "So our work continues." "It never ends," David replied, looking toward the rising sun. "But for now, we've won this battle." 6 months later, David Cole sat in his wheelchair on the courthouse steps, watching as Senator Edward Langston was led away in handcuffs to begin serving his life sentence. The trial had been the most high-profile corruption case in decades, exposing networks of criminal activity that reached into every level of government. Beside David stood Reynolds, now officially assigned as the federal liaison to what the media had dubbed the Phantom Task Force, a specialized unit dedicated to investigating corruption in law enforcement and government. 17 consecutive life sentences, Reynolds noted as the prison transport departed, plus his son facing 60 years. "I'd call that justice." David nodded. "For now. But justice requires vigilance. There will be others to take their place." The months following the showdown at the abandoned military compound had been transformative for Westbrook. With the Langston operation dismantled, the town had begun the painful process of rebuilding its institutions. A new sheriff, elected, with a mandate for transparency, had purged the department of corrupt officers. Businesses once forced to pay protection money now operated freely. Most significantly, dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals had been released from prison as cases built on planted evidence and corrupt testimony were overturned. The true scale of the Langston's corruption had been even more extensive than David initially believed. "Your security firm is reopening next week?" Reynolds asked as they descended the courthouse ramp. "Monday morning," David confirmed. "There's still work to be done in Westbrook. Young people who need guidance, businesses that need protection, legitimate protection." They reached David's modified SUV, where Ghost waited behind the wheel. Though still maintaining his operational security, Jake Wilson had gradually become more visible in their day-to-day operations, his technical expertise proving invaluable to the task force. "We've got movement on the Garcia case," Ghost informed them as David transferred into the passenger seat. "Federal prosecutors are ready to move against the targets we identified." David nodded. "Good. We'll brief in the morning." As they drove through downtown Westbrook, David observed the subtle changes in the town. Storefronts that had been shuttered under Langston's regime were reopening. People walked the streets with a confidence that had been absent before. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Their vehicle pulled up outside David's security consulting firm. The building had been renovated, expanded to accommodate both his private business and the classified operations of the task force. A perfect cover, hiding in plain sight, just as David had done for years. Inside, Alicia Taylor, David's assistant who had maintained the business during his absence, greeted them with her customary efficiency. "The reporter from the Tribune is waiting in your office," she informed David. "She's been very persistent." David sighed. Since the Langston case broke, media interest in his story had been relentless. Most requests he declined, but a few, from journalists who had helped expose corruption, he honored. "Give me 5 minutes," he told Reynolds and Ghost, "then interrupt with an urgent call." The reporter, Sarah Winters, an investigative journalist, whose work had helped connect crucial pieces of the Langston case, stood as David entered his office. "Mr. Cole," she greeted him. "Thank you for making time." David gestured toward the visitor's chair. 15 minutes, Ms. Winters, as agreed." She nodded, activating her recorder. "The Langston conviction has been called the most significant anti-corruption victory in a generation. Now that it's over, what's next for David Cole?" "The work continues," David replied simply. "Corruption doesn't end with one senator or one town. It requires constant vigilance. There are rumors about a specialized task force operating under federal authority, she pressed. Some sources suggest you're involved. David smiled politely. I run a security consulting firm, Ms. Winters. I help businesses protect their assets and train young people in self-defense. She nodded, recognizing the deflection. The public knows you were wrongfully imprisoned, that you exposed corruption at great personal risk. But there are still questions about your background. Military records suggest my military service is a matter of public record, David interrupted smoothly. Wounded in Afghanistan, honorably discharged. Everything else is speculation. The reporter studied him thoughtfully. People call you the Phantom now, a man who can accomplish the impossible despite physical limitations that would stop most people. People enjoy creating legends, Ms. Winters. The reality is usually much simpler. Before she could continue, Reynolds entered with the prearranged interruption. After the reporter departed, David wheeled himself to the window overlooking Westbrook's main street. She's getting closer to the truth, Reynolds observed. Let her, David replied. The legend serves its purpose. It makes corrupt officials nervous, wondering if they're next. Later that evening, David visited the community center he had helped establish in Westbrook's most troubled neighborhood. Using his own funds and federal grants secured through Reynolds' connections, the center provided education, job training, and mentorship to at-risk youth. Inside, a dozen teenagers gathered for David's self-defense class. These weren't ordinary lessons. David taught discipline, awareness, and responsibility alongside physical techniques adapted for real-world situations. Remember, David told the attentive group, true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about protecting yourself and those who can't protect themselves. A young man raised his hand. Mr. Cole, is it true you were Delta Force? David smiled. What matters isn't who I was, Marcus. It's who all of you can become. After class, David met with Marcus Washington, the teenager whose harassment by Detectives Miller and Slade had first pulled David into confrontation with the corrupt system. Now 17, Marcus had become one of David's most promising students. How's the college application coming? David asked as they shared a quiet moment in the center's office. Finished it yesterday, Marcus replied with pride. Criminal justice major, just like we talked about. David nodded approvingly. The system needs good people, Marcus. People who understand both sides of the law. Because of you, Marcus said earnestly. You showed me one person can make a difference, even when everything's against them. Later that night, David returned to his apartment. Not the original one from before his arrest, but a new, more secure location with advanced protections and escape routes. Old habits died hard, especially for a man who had spent his life preparing for worst-case scenarios. As he prepared for bed, his secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Ghost. New information on Operation Clearwater. Corruption extends to federal level. Multiple agencies compromised. Details in morning briefing. David acknowledged the message with a simple response. Understood. This was his life now. Public redemption alongside secret battles. Mentoring young people while hunting corrupt officials, building a better Westbrook while preparing for threats beyond its borders. The wheelchair that many saw as a limitation had become just another adaptation for a man who had spent his life overcoming obstacles. The following morning, David arrived early at his office, reviewing files before his team assembled. The evidence Ghost had uncovered suggested corruption far more extensive than even the Langston network, reaching into federal agencies, crossing state lines, involving officials at the highest levels. Reynolds arrived first, followed by Ghost and two new team members, federal agents handpicked for their incorruptible records and specialized skills. What we're about to discuss doesn't leave this room, David began, activating security protocols that would prevent electronic surveillance. What we found in Westbrook was just the beginning. As David outlined the new threat, his team listened, with growing concern. The battle against corruption wasn't over, it was escalating. But this time, they weren't starting from scratch. They had resources, authority, and most importantly, experience. It won't be easy, David concluded. These targets have power, influence, and they'll fight back harder than Langston ever did. Reynolds nodded grimly. When do we start? We already have, David replied, turning to the evidence wall where photographs of new targets were already arranged. This isn't just about justice anymore. It's about protecting everything we've built. As the team dispersed to begin their assignments, David wheeled himself to the window. Outside, Westbrook continued its daily rhythm, its citizens unaware of the new threats gathering beyond their horizon. David had saved this town once. He would do it again, and again if necessary. A text message appeared on his secure phone. Marcus Washington sharing news of his college acceptance. David smiled, replying with congratulations. This was why the fight mattered, not just bringing down the corrupt, but building up those who would create a better future. That evening, as dusk settled over Westbrook, David Cole prepared for another night of surveillance. The wheelchair that corrupt officers had once mocked had become a symbol, a reminder that appearances deceived, that strength took many forms, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, was never truly defeated. As he left his office, Ghost fell into step beside him. Ready for the next battle? David nodded, his expression resolute. They thought I was weak. They forgot who I was. Together, they moved into the gathering darkness, phantom warriors in an ongoing war that most citizens would never see, but whose freedom depended upon its outcome. The streetlights flickered on as they disappeared into the shadows, two figures blending into the night. The legend of the Phantom would grow, inspiring some and terrifying others. But the truth of David Cole, his determination, his resilience, his unwavering commitment to justice, was more powerful than any legend could capture. And somewhere, in the darkness, corruption waited, unaware that its days were already numbered. What would you do if the system meant to protect you became your greatest enemy? David Cole's story reminds us that justice wears many faces, sometimes arriving from the most unexpected places, in the most unexpected forms. If you enjoyed this tale of righteous vengeance, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the underestimated become unstoppable.